Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. It's great to see so many people here. And to all you folks out there in the virtual land, welcome as well. We hope there's lots of you out there, and we hope that you all have come with not only open minds, but some ideas of things you would like to ask these folks and discuss tonight, because this is a really important topic to be discussing in these times. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Daniel Truckey. I'm director of the Beaumier Upper Peninsula Heritage Center here at Northern. And I will be introducing these fine people in just a minute. What I do want to do is thank some folks who've been helping out tonight. If I could find that, I'd like to thank the folks at Audiovisual Services who helped set us up here tonight. Not only putting all this together, but also the Zoom live stream so that people can see this at home. And I'd like to thank Sheena Ketchum, who is back there. She's going to be monitoring the questions we'll be having come in through Zoom, or we hope we'll get some questions through Zoom during the question and answer period. And I'd like to thank my student assistants who are helping out, passing out those yellow chits that you got, because we have to limit it to 100 people here tonight. And that's Emily Varga and Nate Sarazin. So thank you folks for helping out. And thanks to our panelists as well, who I will be introducing in just a minute. All right. So the format of this is I'm going to make some opening comments. Then I'm going to introduce the speakers. They're each going to make a 5 to 10 minute presentation on critical race theory as it relates to their field of study or their research, the work that they've done. And then I'm going to ask them some questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor to ask questions. Okay, does that sound good to everybody? All right, thumbs up. So how did all this start tonight? Why did we make a decision to have this forum? Well, in November of 2021, the Michigan House of Representatives passed House Bill 5097, which would ban, including in schools' core academic curriculum, anything resembling race or gender stereotyping. And the topics that fell under that definition that would be banned were that individuals act in certain ways or hold certain opinions because of their race or gender, that racism is inherent in individuals from a particular race or ethnic group, or that sexism is inherent in individuals from a particular gender. And also that actions of individuals serve as an indictment against the race or gender of those individuals. And on the surface, that all looks just fine, hunky-dory. We should not stereotype people. But soon thereafter, the state Senate started considering another bill, which was really an extension of this, that kind of focused what this was really all about. Bill 460, which is now been approved by the committee in the Senate and is now going to be going to the floor of the Senate, states, ensures that curriculum provided to all pupils enrolled in a school district or public school academy does not include coverage of critical race theory, the 1619 Project, or any of the following anti-American and racist theories, including that race is inherently superior or inferior to any other race, that the United States is fundamentally a racist country, that the Declaration of Independence or the United States Constitution are fundamentally racist documents, that an individual's moral character or worth is determined by his or her race, that an individual by virtue of his or her race is inherently racist or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. And that by no later than September 30th, 2022, and by not later than September 30th of each year hereafter, the department shall determine each school district and public school academy that is in violation of these and shall withhold 5% of their total funds due to the school district or public school academy under the school state aid. So when we think about this bill that is currently being presented to the state for approval, one really can't not be alarmed by the inherent vagueness of the language. You have to ask yourself, how could such laws even be enforced? Who determines what critical race theory is and how or whether it is being taught in our schools? Also, why is the 1619 Project being specifically targeted? What evidence are opponents using to show that CRT or the 1619 Project contribute to social discord, racial bias, or anti-patriotism? And I should note that when this law was passed into the Senate or in the House of Representatives in November, it was voted 55-0 in the House. The Democrats refused to vote because they were not allowed to comment on it on the floor of the House. Now, I should say that tonight's forum is not intended to persuade people to become critical race theorists or to join some leftist intellectual cause. It is more intended to be informative of what critical race theory actually is, how it is used in academia, and what some of its strengths and weaknesses might be as a school of thought. It is also intended to display some of the misconceptions about what CRT is and how it is actually used or not used in elementary or secondary schools across the state of Michigan. Now, when the Beaumier Center announced that we would be hosting this forum, I had a former faculty member send me a message that he believed we were straying outside the mission of the Heritage Center, which is to celebrate the history and culture of the UP. However, as I explained to him that the current efforts to ban CRT in states and school districts across the United States and state of Michigan does have an impact on heritage centers, history museums, and other humanities organizations. A case in point is the center's current exhibit, The Seventh Fire, about the Anishinaabe people and their perspective on their history, culture, and decolonization, which, though it was not created with a critical race theory playbook, could be construed by the current law being considered in the state Senate as being influenced by CRT and therefore should not be visited by elementary or secondary school students in the area. So as we discuss CRT in this context, we must ask, how do laws such as those being passed or considered in Lansing impact the free speech, academic freedom, and ultimately the freedom of thought? Where there are many claiming cancel culture is taking away their rights, are they not trying to do the same thing by making CRT illegal in our schools? It is these questions and many others that I hope that we will address and discuss and maybe even answer in this forum. And that is why I've selected the 4 people who are sitting here in front of you, because all of them have extensive experience in studying history, culture, literature, anthropology, and know the history of of critical race theory, know how it is applied, how it isn't applied, and what it actually means. And you may or may not agree with everything they say tonight. And I hope that you will stand up and say, you know, I have an issue with this or I have an issue with that when we get to the question period. The first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce our speakers to you. On my far right is Dr. Lesley Larkin, a professor of English, and is the English Master's Program Director here at NMU, where she teaches courses in American literature, literary theory, and composition. She is the author of Race, the Literary Encounter, Black Literature from James Weldon Johnson to Percival Everett, and a co-editor of the forthcoming Encyclopedia of Contemporary American Fiction. She is currently working on a book that focuses on contemporary North American literature and genomics, tentatively titled Reading in the Post-Genomic Age, as well as scholarly articles focused on race and speculative fiction. To her left is Dr. Megan McCune. Megan is an assistant professor of anthropology here at NMU, where she teaches courses in anthropological theory, linguistics, and sociocultural anthropology. Her book chapter is A Question of Fairness, Fee to Trust and Opposition in the Haudenosaunee Land Rights and Economic, thank you so much, Development. And her forthcoming book, No Sovereign Nation, No Reservation, Haudenosaunee Sovereignty Through Land Claim Discourse. Both apply critical race theory and discourse analysis to anti-Indigenous sovereignty movements. Here to my right is Dr. Alan Willis. He is a professor of history at Northern Michigan University, where he teaches American history, African history, African American history, as well as the courses in religious history and history of prejudices. His scholarship focuses on American religion in the Cold War era and the relationship between religious beliefs and ideas about racial and gender order in society. He has recently completed an essay examining Southern baptism and race since 1995, a substantial portion of which focuses on the convention's debates about critical race theory. And then Dr. Carter Wilson is a professor and head of the Political Science Department and Public Administration here at NMU. He is the author of several books and peer-reviewed articles in the areas of public administration, public policy, and civil rights law. His latest article, Blind to the Dignity of the Other, deconstructs originalism and textualism and investigates critical theory, critical race theory, critical feminist theory, and critical queer theory. His most recent book is Trumpism, Race, Class, Populism, and Public Policy. Let's welcome them all. So I'm going to ask each of them to come up and make a presentation on critical race theory. And I'm going to start, we're going to do this alphabetically. So Lesley, if you'd like to be first.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. So as a scholar and teacher of American literature whose work has focused on African American literature and issues of race and racism, I've been somewhat surprised to find that the relatively niche academic field of critical race theory has become the object of widespread public attention, legislative restriction, and moral panic. Although I do not doubt the influence of critical race theory on teachers and scholars in many fields, including the field of education itself, it's also undoubtedly not the case that critical race theory, defined as a specific academic field created by legal scholars in the 1980s, is being taught to American school children. I'm pretty sure that articles published in the Harvard Law Review, for example, are a bit beyond the grasp of your average sixth grader. But I won't belabor this point because I think most of us are aware that the current conversation about critical race theory is not about critical race theory per se. Rather, the phrase critical race theory is a stand-in, and in literary studies, we might call it a metonym for any approach to race that is critical, which is to say any approach that encourages critical thinking about race, is critical of the racial status quo, or exposes the racial fault lines in our national mythologies. Indeed, critical race theory is just the newest in what we might see as a series of such metonyms. About a decade ago, I helped to organize a forum much like this one here at NMU focused on ethnic studies, which at that time was the subject of a similar public controversy and also legislative action, efforts to restrict the teaching of ethnic studies in high schools and in colleges. Some of those efforts were successful. And I'm sure some of you remember the nationwide controversy that followed the Oakland schools' decision to recognize African-American English, then called Ebonics, as a legitimate language for classroom instruction in the 1990s. Not to mention the so-called culture wars that seized American universities in the preceding decades as Black studies, Latino studies, women's studies, queer studies, and other critical fields entered the academy. In other words, what's happening right now isn't exactly new, and really I probably shouldn't have been surprised to find critical race theory the subject of this kind of controversy. And although the movement against CRT in our schools is based on a fiction, the fiction that CRT is being taught in our schools, like race itself, it's a fiction with real world consequences. I was first introduced to the concept of critical race theory around 20 years ago When I was a brand new graduate student studying English at the University of Washington, I was taking a class with a focus on race and gender issues. And it was there that I first read some of the great exponents of contemporary Black feminist thought, people like historian Barbara Fields, literary theorist Barbara Smith, legal scholars Cheryl Harris, Dorothy Roberts, and Kimberly Crenshaw. Although I had studied African American literature in college, my understanding of race and racism was still developing. And it was through the work of these incisive scholars, much of which was formative to critical race theory or influenced by it, that I began to see the outlines and intersections of race and gender oppression as a complex system that affects everyone who lives within it in myriad and diverse ways. Before reading Kimberly Crenshaw's groundbreaking work on intersectionality, I had no language for expressing how my experience of sexism as a woman was modulated by my experience of racial privilege as a white person. Before reading Barbara Fields' explication of race as historical and ideological, I struggled to make sense of the apparent contradiction between race as an idea with no basis in biological reality and race as a real material force in people's lives. And without Cheryl Harris's landmark essay, Whiteness as Property, I had no sense of how what she calls the formal language of equality could be deployed to obscure actual inequalities in our society. In other words, these scholars and their foundational ideas have been crucial to my understanding of race and racism as a scholar and teacher of American literature, and as a white person living in a society where race still matters, even if we don't want it to, or even if we don't want it to matter in the way that it does. Given the vague, as Dan was saying, and often contradictory deployment of critical race theory in public discourse today, it seems worth spelling out some of what I take as foundational ideas that I've drawn from CRT in my own work. And so I'm just going to go through a list of these. The first one is that racism is institutional and structural rather than simply the expression of personal prejudice. This is why, as sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva puts it, we can have racism without racists, which is to say, massive racial inequalities without a massive group of people explicitly espousing racist views. Two, race is a social construction rather than a biological reality that nevertheless has real effects in our lives. Pointing out that race is a fiction, as has been done many times, doesn't seem to be sufficient for overcoming racial inequalities, and so we need another kind of approach. Number three, race is an ideology, a kind of inherited common sense that tells us how to make sense of our world. We learn it both explicitly and implicitly, and we learn it early. As the psychologist Beverly Tatum has written, by preschool age, most American children recognize racial differences and the social meanings that are attached to racial differences. But we can also develop critical racial literacy, as scholars such as France Wyndance Twine and Lonnie Guinier have argued. For race is historical rather than universal. It's not something that we do naturally as human beings. Our race system in the United States was developed in the context of slavery, and indeed was a justification for slavery. And it's been modified over time. I'm sure as many of you are aware, the category white, for example, has changed and expanded over the years, so that people who were not previously included in it are, like many of my ancestors, are included in that category now. And the US race system is also quite different from other race systems around the world, although not unrelated to them. The recognition that race is historical, I think, is an especially important one, because if racial hierarchy has a historical beginning, however intransigent it is, it could also have a historical end. Race and racism are intersectional, which is to say they matter in our lives in ways that are in complex relation to other vectors of our identity and other vectors of oppression, so gender and sexuality and religion and ability, etc. To be a straight, white, cisgender woman, as I am, is meaningfully different from being, for example, a bisexual, Latino, transgender man. And being able to grasp those differences is crucial to creating a plural society. And as a literary scholar, it's also crucial to reading in a diverse literary canon. The sixth item on my list is that race is a matter of concern in the field of law, where CRT was born, and in any number of other fields, including literature. So as the novelist and critic and Nobel laureate Toni Morrison argued, in terms that echo the argument the original CRT scholars made for centering race and legal studies, the study of literature is deeply impoverished if we pretend that it is somehow insulated from issues of race. In Toni Morrison's words, in matters of race, silence and evasion have historically ruled literary discourse. But to enforce its invisibility through silence is to allow the Black body a shadowless participation in the dominant cultural body. Morrison's eloquent argument for an approach to American literature that addresses matters of race and racism brings me to the last point on my list, which is that color blindness, the idea that we shouldn't see race or we shouldn't notice race, contributes to the perpetuation of racial inequity by marking any form of race consciousness or race talk off limits, and thereby limiting our ability to address inequality. I'm certainly not the first person to note that the real object of concern in the panic over critical race theory is the discussion of race itself, as if drawing attention to issues of race is tantamount to being racist. Indeed, the editors of the first CRT anthology wrote about this very phenomenon back in 1995. They said, in the construction of racism as the irrational and backward bias of believing that someone's race is important, the American cultural mainstream linked the Black left to the white racist right. According to this consensus, because race consciousness characterized both white supremacists and Black nationalists, it followed that both were racists. Again, the effect of this kind of silencing on issues of race and racism and the reduction of racism to only the most overt, deliberate expressions of personal prejudice is the perpetuation of a status quo. There are real problems that require real solutions in our society, but it's hard to get to those solutions if we limit what we can talk about. Now, I may not be the best person to talk about policy solutions. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a policy expert. I'm a literary scholar. But as such, I'm committed to the idea that studying literature is crucial to the creation of a just society. Encounters with stories, both stories that reflect our experience and stories that introduce us to the experiences of others, can help us develop the kind of critical consciousness required of citizens in a plural society. This is why the effort to silence teachers on the facts of American history or to remove books from libraries and classrooms is so disheartening. But it's also not surprising. Schools can educate students to maintain the status quo or to change it, and the latter can be quite frightening or unsettling. Recently, I reread a book called Dark Water, published in 1920 and written by W.E.B. Du Bois, a really important Black scholar and intellectual and leader from the first half of the 20th century. And somebody whose ideas have really influenced critical race theory. In Dark Water, Du Bois devotes an entire chapter to the problem of education, arguing that inadequate schooling not only fails individual children, but also fails all of us by maintaining an unjust and limited status quo. In his words, the world regards and always has regarded education first as a means of buttressing the established order of things rather than improving it. Instead of seeking to push the coming generation ahead of our pitiful accomplishment, we insist that it march behind. We say morally that high character is conformity to present public opinion. So channeling Du Bois, I would say that present public opinion is, at least in some quarters, that critical race theory is a threat to our nation, but we need not conform to that opinion. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you all for coming. I see a lot of my students in here too, so I apologize for the overlap in what I'm about to say. So I teach in anthropology. I actually teach critical race theory. explicitly and purposely in my classes. So and a little bit about my background. So I was born and raised in Metro Detroit. I was, for those of you who are Metro Detroiters, I grew up right in between 9 Mile and 10 Mile, right off of Woodward. So and Detroit is one of the most segregated cities in the United States, and was when I was growing up in the 1980s and 1990s. So when I first encountered critical race theory in college, it really helped me make sense of my experience growing up in Metro Detroit. I had a mother who worked in the city, lived in the suburbs, felt that shift every time you cross, 8 Mile, as to the structural racism, that affects Metro Detroiters, Black Metro Detroiters in particular. When I went to Wells College, that's when I encountered, again, critical race theory for the first time. I was really thankful to be given the space in classrooms to work through, those ideas. And I encourage that with my students too. It's uncomfortable if you're white, to have to, kind of encounter white privilege and whiteness, and kind of what that means for you and your life and how it affects other people. So, again, very thankful for that experience in college. My research is based on things that I observed when I was an undergraduate student at Wells College, which is in central New York State. So I was just telling some of my students this morning, but when I was driving to college as a first-year student, in the fall of 1999, which is before a lot of you were born, I came down the side of Cayuga Lake, which is this large finger lake in central New York State, and there were these big signs just along Route 90, which was the main road, and they said, "No sovereign nation, no reservation." And I was like, what is that? Well, the Cayuga Nation, which is one of the federally recognized Native nations in New York State, had filed a land claim in 1980 to get their land back that was taken illegally by New York State in the 1700s. And they had fought that for years and years and years. And it wasn't until the 1980s where they were given legal standing to actually bring suit against New York State to get their land back. And there was a group of non-Native people, white folks, that organized against that. They did not want a reservation established in Cayuga and Seneca counties, and they're very active. So I was really interested in that. That actually became my dissertation. So the publications that were cited earlier this evening, that's what I wrote about, right? So I'm a legal anthropologist. I study racism, right? And I use critical race theory. It definitely informs the work that I do. I also, in that pay particular attention to whiteness, right, and white privilege. I look at how discourses of racism are embedded in our United States Supreme Court cases, and how that influences how folks in, say, Cayuga and Seneca County think about Native people, and that how their discourse, right, how they speak about Indigenous peoples, then influences contemporary United States court decisions, right? And just to give you a sense of this, Robert Williams Jr. has a book called Like a Loaded Weapon, which looks at the Rehnquist court and looks at the discourses of racism in the Rehnquist court, and how these decisions in the Supreme Court, even the ones that are in favor supposedly of like Indigenous sovereignty, contain this language that sits for a while until it can be used against Indigenous people, right? And so he has this quote in his 2005 book where he said, "You can tell the justices know all about the language of racism historically directed at Indians in America simply by reading their opinions on Indian rights," right? So, in terms of Indigenous peoples, there's all of this overt racism that exists in these Supreme Court cases. And we can look at them and say, well, yeah, a lot of those were back in the 1800s. So there's a lot of just racist discourse that was normalized. But we have, one of the most landmark cases in Indigenous law, contemporary Indigenous law, came down in 2005, and it was the City of Sherrill decision. And that was actually authored by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? Who we have this perception of being, on the left and in support of things like, fighting against racism. She authored the majority opinion in that case, which called the Oneida's sovereignty ancient, and basically said that the Oneida Nation cannot unilaterally revive its ancient sovereignty. And that's loaded in terms of racial stereotyping. And that's 2005, authored by Ginsburg. I will note that there's kind of this, in legal circles, talk that was, as she was nearing the end of her life, that case was one of her biggest regrets. But, it still stood, and it was interpreted, and it effectively ended all Indigenous land claims on the East Coast of the United States, right? So it had a really, really profound effect there. So, that's how I use that in my research. In my teaching, I don't know how I would teach anthropology without critical race theory, right? So when you look at some of the early anthropologists in the United States, one in particular, Franz Boas, is known as the father of American anthropology. And he was someone I think critical race theorists would have liked to talk to back in the day, because he was really arguing against these ideas that race exists as a biological reality. Right? His background, he's Jewish. He immigrated to the United States in the early 1900s. He definitely experienced racism in Germany before he came to the United States. During that time period, it was accepted within most sciences that white people were just superior biologically. There was all of the pseudoscience out there from folks like Johann Blumenbach and Samuel Morton, where they did what was called craniometric studies, which is bunk, by the way. I'm just going to put that out there. But they did these like measurements of people's skulls and made this argument that white people are superior because their brain sizes were bigger. And Boas was one of the individuals that said, well, hey, let's just try to like do this scientifically and measure people's skulls and see what happens. And lo and behold, right, white people do not have the biggest brains. And there's just this normal average brain variation, brain size variation that exists, right? So, in our foundation of our discipline, it's there, race is not this biological or scientific reality. When I teach about race, we talk about how it's just this hodgepodge of different physical characteristics that are all lumped, together. When we teach this from a physical anthropology side, right, we have most of our physical variations are just a result of where our ancestors were hanging out. You cannot see, because I have this mask on right now, I have a really big nose, and I have a really big nose because my ancestors were hanging out in northern Finland where it was cold, and when you breathe in the air and a big nose, it warms it up, right? So that's just a nice variation there, environmental adaptation, right, to climate. So we talk about things like that. And we also talk about systemic racism, right? We can quantify this. This is one of those things when I hear people say, well, systemic racism doesn't exist, right? And that you're racist for pointing it out, that it might exist. We have sociologists and anthropologists and social psychologists who have measured this in a quantitative way. Right? I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'm partial to qualitative research, but I do like when I have the quantitative, research to back that up. And one of, I think, the most powerful articles that I use in my teaching is called "Would You Hire an Ex-Convict?" It's by Deva Pager. And what she did as part of her dissertation work is she did this study in the greater Milwaukee area in the 1990s and sent out applications to see like who would get a job, if they were applying for a job. And she had, students and graduate students who would interview for these jobs in pairs. And the variables that she limited it down to is that one of them would have a criminal record, would report a criminal record, and it would alternate each job application between one person and the other one. And the other main difference was their race, right? So one individual was Black, the other was white. And she did this and measured, right, to see who got callbacks for interviews and who got job offers, right? The people who got job offers were the white men without a criminal record first, right? Then the white men with a criminal record, then Black men without a criminal record, and then Black men with a criminal record, right? And so that looks at, not only the effects of stereotyping in terms of race, but also, right, criminal records there, but it's quantified, it's there. And that's just one of the studies, that we can point to say that people of color experience this, right, in a very real way. It affects jobs, it affects housing, it affects health, right? We can quantify it in medical fields and see that women of color die at this disproportionate rates in childbirth, and other, medical events as compared to white women. It's staggering, when you look at those numbers. So, again, like Lesley, when I hear that, people say, well, this doesn't exist, I'm like, it does, right? It's there. It's very, very simple to see, right? The other main kind of tenet of critical race theory that I use a lot and I find especially important, it comes from Derek Bell, which is looking at this, what's called interest convergence, right? Where we can point to some of these, landmark, say, US Supreme Court cases or policies that come down, from the federal government that seem to, give folks more rights, right? Or try to address wrongdoings. When really, if you kind of look at that, those are always kind of paired with what the interests of the dominant group are white folks at the time. The main case that, or point that Derek Bell used in his article was looking at the civil rights movement in general and desegregation, right, and the ending of those Jim Crow laws. And yes, that did benefit, especially at the time, right, people of color. But it was also done strategically because the United States was involved in a Cold War with Russia and was trying to win over, right, brown and black nations of people. And that was really difficult to do when they were treating brown and black people within their own country in that way, right? So, again, those interests, they converge. In my own work, I talked about, some of those cases that affect Native nations, and I mentioned the Oneida Nations case. So the Oneida Nation, like the Cayuga Nation, were trying to file a land claim in the 1960s and 70s. They were repeatedly told, you can't file this claim, even though New York State probably took your land illegally, because you don't have legal standing to bring a case against a state, right? Like if I just wanted to randomly sue the state of Michigan, I can't do that. I have to go through all these legal hoops to do that. But in federal Indian law, Native nations did not have the right to bring cases, right, and through the federal court system. Until the Oneida's lawyers kind of did this legal maneuvering where they said, well, okay, because these prior court cases like Johnson v. McIntosh, which was like the first foundational case affecting Indigenous peoples. And what that said is that the United States government holds underlying title to all Indigenous land, right? This is before the United States had done its manifest destiny. So they're moving across the continent. And Johnson v. McIntosh in the early 1800s said, it doesn't matter, if a Native Nations owns the land or a private individual buys the land or the state, buys the land from a Native nation. The United States basically has that first right because they own that underlying title, for all Indigenous land. And in those Oneida cases, what the Oneida Nation did is they made the argument of, well, New York State didn't just take Oneida land, they took US government land, right? Because it was reservation land. And then the United States got interested, right? Because they were like, oh, that is our land, and they joined in on the case, and that gave the Oneida Nation the legal footing to file their land claim, right? It wasn't because the United States government was really benevolent. It was like, you have been wronged. It was that the United States government was like, we have underlying title to all Indigenous land. So New York State took our land, and that's not okay, right? So I think that's, you'll get another example there of that interest convergence. Just a couple of final thoughts here. I think the concept of intersectionality for critical race theory is so important. I think that gets lost a lot too in the kind of the discussions and the misinformation about critical race theory that's out there, right? That social class matters a lot, right? Gender matters a lot. Sexual orientation matters a lot. When we're talking about race, we are just talking about race, but we need to see, right, how class and gender, religion, educational status, so on and so forth affects individuals' experiences, right? And so, that's an important part that's left out of that discussion. Another, issue, and we probably are going to talk about this a little bit later, but critical race theory, unlike, say, the kind of early civil rights movement, was really focused in on not over, I want to like do a revolutionary thing, but changing the system, right? Changing that social structure there. It's focused in on that activism. A lot of critical race theorists will actually go back to Karl Marx, and we'll use that famous quote from Marx of, philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. Right. So to keep working to break down, those oppressive structures. And I think that's really liberating. I think that's liberating for all of us, when we look at those structures. And, speaking as someone who's white, who benefits from the racial system that's in place right now, I want to tear that down, right? Because I see how it intersects too with other things like social class and gender. It's a really useful form of analysis. I will say too, anecdotally, in all of my years of teaching this, I mean, I've never had pushback on it. I used to be able to say in class when, I was teaching about race that, oh, critical race theorists say this, and my students would go, okay, and nod, and now it kind of gets that reaction of, I can see some students tensing up just because of how it's been, discussed in the media and really, mischaracterized in the media. I did take the strategy this semester where I went through the tenets of critical race theory, which Lesley, did a nice job giving an overview of. And I didn't tell my students it was critical race theory until the very end, right? So they were all nodding, they're like, yeah, well, this is true. And I was like, and that was critical race theory, dun, 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 right? So anyway, that's just some of my thoughts there. Like I said, I personally have benefited from it. I cannot teach my discipline without it. Can't do my research without it. It really helps. It's a nice lens and especially applied with some others, right? To understanding our social reality. So thank you.
So my approach is somewhat different because instead of looking specifically at critical race theory, I want to look at how history has been affected as a discipline by this discussion and this attack on critical race theory. So I want to think about where the field of African American history is and how it got there, and then how some of these anti-CRT laws are affecting it. And I looked at an essay by a historian by the name of Robert Surbiton. He noted several intriguing trends in American history, concluding that, in short, the most recent scholarship begins to view the African American as a key to the meaning of the American experience. And a particular experience in light of these legislative proposals to ban critical race theory. He discussed the recent scholarship relating slavery directly to the formation of political institutions such as the Constitution and parties. And this would sound a lot like he was using critical race theory or was attached to the 1619 Project. But we know that he wasn't, and neither were any of the scholars that he was reviewing. And we know this for the simple reason that he wrote in the spring of 1968, and he couldn't have used critical race theory because it simply didn't yet exist. And these were not all Marxist historians or all progressive historians or all consensus historians or all social historians. They came from a broad range of the historical field. And he was clearly not alone in noticing this. In 1972, again, considerably before critical race theory really formulates into an organized theory, Edmund Morgan, who was at the time and remains probably one of the most prominent, he's no longer with us, but one of the most prominent colonial historians, he gave a talk entitled Slavery and Freedom, the American Paradox. And he argued that to dismiss the rise of liberty and equality in American history as a mere sham is not only to ignore the facts, it's also to evade the problem presented by those facts. The rise of liberty and equality in this country was accompanied by the rise of slavery. The two such contradictory developments were taking place simultaneously over a long period of our history is the central paradox of American history. Looking at Florida, he determined that not only did liberty and equality for whites across the 17th and 18th century, that it wasn't just concurrent with the increase of slavery, but in fact, it was dependent upon it. His work also clearly predated critical race theory, although it may be argued that critical race theorists and others have continued this investigation into the American paradox, specifically the legal scholars who were asking how a justice system dedicated to equality before the law could so consistently fail to deliver equal justice. So some of what I think we need to do is to ask why so many people believe that the historical scholarship, which traces its intellectual roots well before critical race theory into the 70s and 60s, was actually part of critical race theory, which they don't like. Those are the people who are against it, and is tied to the 1619 Project. And clearly part of the reason for that is that in this backlash, that critical race theory is going to become this whipping post to smear everything. And so people in the public eye have often used that to the idea that it's tied to critical race theory to basically smear any history about race that they don't happen to like. But I think that the real answer as to how these two happen is that there's been a convergence of conclusions. The evidence that race and racism has shaped a multitude of American institutions that are public, private, secular, and religious is simply overwhelming, and that legal scholars found the same thing as historians did, because frankly, if you took an honest assessment of the situation, how could you miss it? The evidence is simply overwhelming. Now, there are some people who are caught up in this, and I think I can be a little sympathetic to them. And that is some parents who are facing a situation where poorly taught classes about race create discord or where misunderstandings happen. And one example was of a young girl in Tennessee. Something clearly went wrong. She was mixed race background, and she came home and told her mother that after a lesson on Ruby Bridges and the desegregation of the New Orleans schools, she told her African-American mother that she hated her white father for being white. Obviously, something went wrong. I don't know exactly what went wrong, but what I do believe is that the answer here is not attacking critical race theory, that in fact, training for teachers in critical race theory, which is something that a lot of these laws want to ban, probably would have helped rather than hurt. And I also don't think that the answer is to ban books about Ruby Bridges' struggle or Birmingham or any of the other aspects of the civil rights movement. There's another group of people for whom I don't have any sympathy, and those would be the politicians and political activists promoting the anti-CRT legislation. Dan already pointed to the Michigan law, but I want to talk a little bit about one in Florida and one in South Carolina. So the Florida bill, a lot's been said about this Florida bill that makes it illegal to make people uncomfortable, or that's one way of interpreting what it says. It's vague enough that it could mean a lot of things. A lot's been said about that, but another part of this bill also says, it mandates that American history will be viewed as factual, not as constructed, shall be viewed as knowable, teachable, testable, and shall be defined as the creation of a new nation based largely on the universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. Intriguingly, the bill itself misquotes the Declaration of Independence, substituting pursuit of property where Jefferson wrote pursuit of happiness. But the other side of the problem is this idea that they say history will be factual and not constructed. Historians are pretty picky about their facts, very picky about our facts. So you're not going to find an historian who's going to object to the idea that history should be factual, but we all agree on that. History should be knowable and teachable and testable. But all history is constructed. And the reason is actually pretty simple. At one level, it's pretty simple. It gets more complicated, obviously. But the simple basis for that is simply too much has ever happened. And you simply cannot take account of every single fact that ever happened. And so you automatically have to choose which facts to include and which facts not to include. And as soon as you make that decision, you are constructing one particular narrative of history as opposed to a different particular narrative of history. And so all history is constructed. So you can't say that history won't be constructed, especially when you are writing a bill that specifically constructs history to give one particular narrative about American history. Which is what the Florida bill does, telling us, for example, that students will study the arguments in favor of adopting the Constitution as lined out by the most important Federalist Papers. They are automatically telling you what evidence you will use and what evidence you won't. And they are not encouraging you there to explore either the anti-federalists who opposed it, or later folks like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, who attacked it because of its relationship to slavery. South Carolina proposes something similar, but what they are saying is it will be forbidden to instruct students with respect to the relationship to American values, that slavery and racism are anything other than deviations, betrayals of, failures to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States, which include liberty and equality. So if that bill were to pass, and it passed the Senate, I suspect in South Carolina it will pass. If it passes, it would demand that that Central American paradox, where the liberty of one race was built on the enslavement of another, be taught as if half the equation were somehow inauthentic. The law would seem to prohibit teaching the possibility, easily demonstrated through documentary evidence, that white supremacy was so interwoven into the fabric of American society in the late 1700s and later, that it was as authentic a part of the founding generation's beliefs as were the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality. And once you deem something inauthentic, you're saying it's fake, it's not there. And if it's not authentic, if this is authentic and that's not authentic, this is what matters, and that is obviously devalued as part of the study. And yet that paradox is the central issue. How do these two things go? What is that relationship? Simply deeming one side inauthentic doesn't help us understand the interplay. And so I would argue that historians and the legal scholars who developed critical race theory converged upon some pretty disconcerting conclusions from a lot of people's perspectives. But I would say that laws that declare a particular narrative of history to be correct can't undo the realities of history. They can only attempt to hide it from a generation of school children, and that, I don't think, will help us move forward and address the problems of systemic racism that, as you carefully pointed out, clearly exist and are easily identifiable in society if you care to pay attention to the evidence.
Okay, I develop a critique of these anti-critical race theory laws, and I develop my critique into what I call 5 vignettes. First vignette. This past summer, Yale University professor, renowned expert on autocratic and totalitarian regimes, Timothy Snyder published an article in which he claimed that these types of laws are similar to what he calls memory control laws common in autocratic countries like Russia, Turkey, Hungary, and they threaten democracy. In response to Snyder, the editor of the conservative journal, the National Review, Rich Lurie, claimed that Professor Snyder was hysterical and that he misrepresented anti-critical race theory, and that he either doesn't know what he's talking about because he hasn't taken the time to understand these laws, or he's deliberately deceptive. Lurie insisted that these laws do not ban the teaching of slavery, Jim Crow, or genocide. They simply permit any mention or discussion of systemic racism because these discussions are divisive and unnecessary. Lurie's arguments are eerily similar to the same arguments used in Turkey and Russia. Teachers in Russia and Turkey may cover genocide. However, Turkish teachers are strictly forbidden from suggesting that the Ottoman Empire was responsible for the Armenian genocide. Russian teachers are forbidden from suggesting that the Stalinist regime was responsible for the Ukrainian genocide. Discussions of systemic oppression are strictly forbidden. Second, in 1848, 106 years before the Brown v. Board of Education decision, Charles Sumner argued on behalf of his 5-year-old client, Sarah Roberts. In this Roberts v. City of Boston case, Sumner argued, and he argued before the Massachusetts Supreme Court, that if this court accepted the separate but equal legal fiction and allow the city of Boston to exclude Sarah from the school located next door to where she lived simply because the color of her skin branded her as undesirable, then this court would be guilty of legalizing a racial caste system in the United States as oppressive and as invidious as the racial caste system in India. This 1848 case is important because, in my opinion, it marked the introduction of critical race theory into American law. It demonstrates that critical race theory is part of American legal history. The idea that critical race theory is racist and un-American is as preposterous as the idea that the earth is flat. Third, 8 years after this decision, the Supreme Court delivered the Dred Scott decision. Most high school graduates know that this decision denied Dred Scott his freedom. However, most high school graduates are unaware that in this decision, Chief Justice Taney stated that Blacks are inferior to whites, that Blacks are not American citizens. Even Blacks who were free and born in the United States were not American citizens, that neither the Declaration of Independence nor the US Constitution applies to Blacks, and that a Black man has no rights that any white man is bound to respect. 6 other justices joined Taney in this decision. The very idea that the Taney court was not dominated by racist justices is as patently false as the idea that it doesn't snow in Marquette in the wintertime. Fourth, 30 years ago, Harvard University law professor Derek Bell, who he often complains that he's sometimes given the title as the father of critical race theory, he complained about that, argued that critical race theory, in fact, this was his article, Who's Afraid of Critical Race Theory? Critical race theory challenged conventional wisdom, interrogated multiple competing perspectives on constitutional law, and encouraged broad, open-minded critical thinking. And I also enjoyed his conversion theory too, which is applicable today. Critical race theory is now and has always been antithetical to both indoctrination and racism. The very idea that critical race theory is racist and un-American and a form of indoctrination is not only false, but it's such a profound expression of doublespeak that George Orwell is probably turning over in his grave right now. Finally, these memory control laws did not originate, and this is specifically SB 460, they didn't originate from the Michigan Republican Party. Over 120 of these laws have been proposed in well over 33 states. 10 states have passed some form of these laws. If what the CEO of the American Legislative Exchange Council says is true, these laws originated from the American Exchange Council, a centralized organization that sets the public policy agenda for state Republican Party organizations. Alex has played a major role in campaigning for the enactment of these laws. Alex has been successful in securing the passage of voter suppression laws, of right to work law, and again, the intersection of race and class, stand your ground laws, and several other reactionary type laws. Indeed, these memory control laws are part of a larger political movement. Fox News has operated as a centralizing propaganda machine. In any autocratic country, you're going to have a propaganda machine, a centralizing propaganda machine that coordinates and energizes the anti-race theory movement. Conservative think tanks have been coming out producing anti-critical race theory articles for the past 20, 30 years, but they have just now gained momentum because of the activities of Alex and Fox News. Fox News barely mentioned critical race theory at the beginning of 2021. By June and July, it was mentioned an average of over 250 times a week. Each mention was accompanied by false information calculated to stoke rage and provoke grassroots opposition to the teaching of a non-existing critical race theory curriculum in public schools. It's non-existing in public schools, but they're very effective in provoking that rage and opposition. Make no mistake about it. These memory control laws not only dumb down the curriculum of public schools, they are based on lies and doublespeak. They constitute a form of state censorship and indoctrination. They emerged as part of a larger reactionary political movement. Insofar as an informed and educated populace is the bedrock of a democratic society, these laws are a direct threat to our democratic society.
Well, I want to thank you all for 4 incredibly powerful, informative, and thought-provoking presentations. I'm very happy that you all volunteered to do this. I'm going to ask some questions of them individually, though they can all chime in after the first person has kind of spoken. And then after I'm done, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Also, if you're at home watching or in your office, wherever, and you want to ask a question via Zoom, you can do so through the chat function. Type it in, and Sheena will bring those up to me later, and we will go through those as we get to that point. Just listening to you folks talk, I had some questions written down, and then other things came up into my mind. I wanted to ask Alan, because you brought up the 1619 project. And first of all, how many of you have read the 1619 project? Heard a number of you have. Well, you know what? You all can. New York Times publishes it. You can find it on their website, and we have that as a part of our library subscription, correct, Lesley? Yes. So if you're a student here at NMU or a faculty member, you can go on to the New York Times and read the New York Times. You don't have to have a subscription, and you can read the 1619 Project. But Alan, I want to ask you, there's been a lot of criticism of the 1619 Project, not only just from anti-critical race theory people, but also historians who aren't necessarily anti-critical race theorists. What are some of those criticisms, in particular with looking at the Revolutionary War and the reasons for the Revolutionary War? Because the critical race theory, or I'm sorry, 1619 Project, one of the articles says that the desire to protect slavery was one of the main reasons for the Revolutionary War. And there's a lot of historians who have taken some issue with that. I wanted to get your thoughts on why there has been such a backlash against the 1619 Project.
Okay, so I think that there are some issues with the 1619 Project. I mean, history is a debatable terrain in a lot of ways. There are certainly, I think, historians who believe that the 1619 Project maybe overcorrects for issues that had been left out before. That the case of the Revolutionary War being one of them, and the idea that this sort of a concept of tracing America's roots to 1619 certainly stokes a lot of dissent as to when can one say the country was founded. But speaking particularly to the issue of the Revolutionary War, the 1619 Project, I think, is on target in some intriguing ways. That there were in 1775 considerable fears of slave uprisings in South Carolina and in Virginia, and that the actions of Governor Campbell in South Carolina and Lord Dunmore, who is the governor in Virginia, certainly aided to stoking these fears. And then Lord Dunmore's proclamation in November of 1775, which says essentially that African Americans who abandon the plantations and fight for the British will be granted their freedom if they survive the war and the typhoid and the yellow fever and the cholera and everything else that you're going to get along the way. So your chances weren't good, but your chances weren't good in that sense, no matter who you were. And it is true that the South Carolina representative to the Second Continental Congress, a man named Edward Rutledge, was actually sent from South Carolina to stop the march towards independence. Says that Lord Dunmore's proclamation did more than anything else to cause the split between the colonies and England to be irreparable. Now that may well have been true for South Carolina. It's much more questionable. In Virginia, it's clear that it pushed the Tidewater elite towards the Patriot side, but the upcountry further inland had already moved in that direction. I don't think that Dunmore's proclamation had much of an effect. I mean, things were progressing in New England and Massachusetts in one direction. They were progressing in the South in a different direction. But I do think that there is that fear. It gets written into the Declaration of Independence. One of the last of the list of grievances is about inciting revolts by domestic enemies, and also inciting attacks by Native Americans that he refers to as savages. And so there is definitely evidence, I think, that that was a factor. That in South Carolina in particular, and in the Tidewater of Virginia, that was a factor. But I think you could go too far as well, because there are some other major factors happening as well. South Carolina is not happy about a variety of the taxes either. So what the problem in the past, I think, was the story of the run-up to the American Revolution gets told as basically a New England phenomenon. We should correct that. We should point out what's happening in the South. But we shouldn't let that override what's also happening in New England. I mean, this is the basic problem that Edmund Morgan, I think, was trying to say. You can't say that these other ideals were a sham, but you also can't say that defense of slavery and the maintenance of this institution wasn't a factor. So it's possible, and I think to some extent, the 1619 Project can be criticized because certain aspects have been left out for so long and overlooked. Is it, most of what I've seen historians arguing is that it's an overcorrection, that it goes a little bit too far in the direction of moving away from other factors. I think that, maybe you need the overcorrection in order to get to the right point, because textbooks and things were not moving in that direction on their own. Is that?
That's an excellent answer. Thank you very much. Lesley, Carter brought this up, but I wanted to ask you specifically because of your experience in teaching and using CRT in your teaching. But one of the criticisms against CRT that you read about in the media is that it will divide us. That by talking about these issues critically, talking about the realities, truth about the importance of slavery and racism in creating America and our systems of government, our laws, that it creates divisiveness. In your experience in teaching these things, is that what you have seen? Have you seen it create divisions between students? And if so, or have you seen it have a different impact on how we create dialogue in these issues in classrooms?
That's such an interesting and important question. Through all of these presentations, we've heard a lot about the divisions that exist, the rifts that exist in American society, and what many CRT theorists call colorblind ideology, this imperative that we don't notice, we don't talk about race, that the most ethical approach to issues of race is just to try to pretend them away, papers over what should be very obvious glaring divisions in our society. So my first response to that is that the divisions are there, and we can choose either to talk about them or to continue obscuring them. But in terms of how this functions in the classroom, no, that's not been my experience, that using some of the concepts introduced by critical race theory creates division in conversations about race in the classroom. In fact, I think particularly the insight that racism is structural and systemic rather than simply the expression of personally held negative beliefs about other people based on racial groups, that insight alone can create a lot of space for talking about race and racism in a way that isn't so immediately emotionally charged, because we're actually looking at systems and structures that are in excess of any single person's will or intention. Which is not to say that we don't as individuals have responsibilities within those systems, but just that racism is bigger than any single one of us, and acknowledging that I think can sometimes turn down the heat a little bit on those conversations and also make room for discussions about how we can collaborate as members of a plural society, as members of a democratic society on solving some of these issues. I think one of the reasons that sometimes this claim that racism is systemic brings about such a charged response from people is that they're still operating from this idea that racism means nothing other than personally held negative beliefs about other groups based on race. And so if you say that racism is everywhere, then you must be saying that every white person in America holds the most, negative beliefs about people who aren't white. But if we can move the conversation past that kind of limiting understanding of race, I actually think it creates a lot of room for discussion rather than sort of immediately polarizing the discussion. And that's been my experience mostly in the classroom, which is not to say that I haven't had difficult conversations or that, students sometimes don't, push back on these kinds of concepts. Of course, there's lots of different opinions that are raised in the classroom, and we have to work through together our understanding of something as complex as race and racism. I remember going through that myself as a young, relatively sheltered product of white suburban America. But I think that critical race theory does a really good job of giving us language for talking our way through those difficult conversations.
Would you others have a similar response to that? I mean, in your own experience? Feel free to turn on your microphones. I know. Or you don't have to, you could say, no, it's been awful every time I talk about
it. It helps broaden the conversation. And I think the most important thing is that when you talk about these issues, and when instructors, faculty are talking about these issues, we are broadening our students' understanding of the world. And my experience is that my students appreciate that.
Okay.
I'll just say, can I just add one thing too?
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
been really interesting to me over the, I have been teaching for over 20 years now, if you count my graduate student teaching time as well. And the responses of students to these kinds of concepts have really changed, which is a testament, I think, to how mainstream some critical race theory ideas have become. And, I have two teenagers who are on TikTok all of the time. They know the intersectionality. They understand the notion of systemic racism, at least on a basic level. So today, students are coming into the classroom with an awareness of this vocabulary and these concepts that wasn't the case 10 or 15 years ago, regardless of what their attitude about them might be, that the starting point is different than it used to be, which is pretty interesting and changes the conversation too.
Yeah, I have a 17-year-old daughter who is just really sharp in this stuff. And I think back when I was 17, my mind was football, and there's just so much further beyond than we were at that age, to be honest with you. I mean, our worldview was so much more limited in that respect. I thought about other things in football, but that was my main preoccupation at the time. Well, this does bring this whole to me. What is the fear here? You talked about that these have become part of our society. They've been that our young people, this is in their world already. They already understand many of these things. What is the fear? Why is this backlash occurring?
No, go ahead.
Well, I was recently reading something that was saying that critical race theory would teach, I mean, part of it is the misunderstanding, right? That It is saying that all whites are horrendously racist. And as you point out, one of the main books one of the most famous books in critical race theory is Ms. Silva's Racism Without Racists, which I think gets to that point. But I was also reading this, it was saying that it would, this was an outside perspective that I didn't agree with, but that it would convince minority populations, particularly African Americans, so this individual was talking about, that the world's stacked against them, it's hopeless, they're victims, and they might as well just give up because systematic racism is going to prevent them from ever doing anything with their lives. And that certainly is not, and it's just this was written by an African American, but that is I don't think ever what somebody like Kimberly Crenshaw or Eric Bell or any of the other people would have said, that saying that there are these injustices in society that certain people face doesn't, under their theory, I mean, one of the fears, I guess, is that some people will take this as there is no opportunity, there is no equality, there is no equality, but that there's no opportunity, that things can't get better, right? Because one of the ways I think that Alec and some of the others have painted critical race theory is that critical race theory says these things are inherent, they're permanent, they're immutable. But in fact, if you think that, if you read critical race theory, there's a recognition that it's a socially constructed system that was put in place by people, can be taken out of place by people. If there's an awareness, if you uncover the problems, you can remove those problems. And so some of the attack is people completely misunderstanding and saying that we're saying that critical race theorists say this is permanent, can't be changed, and we can never get better. And that isn't, in my opinion, what it means at all. But there is that I think for some people, that's an intentional misinformation, and some people it's a misunderstanding.
Megan, a lot of actually, one of the criticism of the 1619 project was that it didn't look at systemic racism against Native Americans. It didn't look at Latino Americans. It was primarily about the African American experience. And the creator said, well, we were looking specifically at chattel slavery. We weren't looking at those things, but those are obviously oversights that they wish they could, that in the future they hope will handle. But how have you seen the impact of CRT and how we study what happened to the original people of North America? And how would banning our ability to do that, how would banning impact the ability to tell this story?
You couldn't tell it without critical race theory. I do want to kind of back up a little bit and say, for critical race theorists, that there's this divide and debate among folks about, that's like the Black exceptionalism, right? That, Black folks were enslaved and therefore that's basically like the standard, that's as worse as it gets. And therefore, other minority groups kind of have to compare themselves to that experience. And then there's the folks within critical race theory who disagree with that and say, well, everyone experiences race in different ways, right? So racial minorities experience race in different ways, and that should come to the table, and we should, approach critical race theory that way. So there's, just to put, for folks that maybe haven't read a lot about critical race theory, there is that internal debate and dialogue, that's there. I think from my work, I don't ever like to compare I what other people call like the oppression Olympics. Like, I'm not interested in that. I'm just interested in like dismantling those systems of oppression, in general. But, for Indigenous peoples, you do have a legacy of slavery there too. You have land loss. You have all of those things that are systemic, that are still around today, right? Just like everything else that we've mentioned are still around today. So I don't know how you talk about, poverty rates and health issues and the economic struggles that Native nations have, trying to provide for their people without being able to talk about systemic racism. Like you just can't do that. You could kind of do a workaround, and there has a critique too within Native studies that Indigenous peoples have been raced, right, when really they're political entities. But that's a whole other discussion that we can have during my office hours if you ever want to chat about it. So there is kind of that workaround there to talk about, political oppression in terms of, of political identity, but it's still systemic. I mean, at the end of the day, it's systemic. So I don't know how you explain that in a classroom either. I mean, I used to be on a school board before I moved here. So I was the vice president of the Salamanca City Central School District, which is a school district that is almost entirely on the Seneca Nation's Allegheny territory. Right? About 50% of the kids in our district are Indigenous. We had a school board member who very publicly was against critical race theory, which I was perplexed by, because even though I do push back at this idea that, critical race theory, or the assertion that it's taught in the K through 12 system, because it's not explicitly taught, but we do teach about systemic racism in the K through 12 system. And for Salamanca and Seneca students in particular, like, I don't know how you talk about the construction of the Kinzua Dam in the 1960s, which flooded a third of the Seneca Nation's Allegheny territory, without talking about systemic racism. Like, you can't do that. I mean, you can't just say, oh, the federal government just said, we're just going to build this here, and that was it, and now it's there. I mean, that's not the story, right? And so, yeah, you can't teach Native history without talking about systemic oppression.
All right, thank you. Carter, when we first started talking about, had our first meeting, I think we only had one real meeting before we did this thing, but I brought up that, I think the whole thing behind these state laws, they're just trying to force Governor Whitmer into a corner to sign, to veto it so they can use it as a campaign issue. And you vehemently said no. And I'd like to get your perspective on that, because I took this as this is just a political move. They're not serious about this, but you said no, and why?
And this is also related to your previous question. Why the attack on critical race theory? And I think that when you think in terms of why the attack on critical race theory, it begs the question of what role does race and racism play in American society? And who benefits from a mass movement to stop the teaching of issues like diversity and inclusion? Of course, I'm sure you all know the President of the United States came out in opposition to diversity training, and then he also joined in on the assault on critical race theory. And one thing that's missing here too is why racism persists and what function does it serve in American society, and who gains from the persistence of racism. And here, this other thing too, 100 years ago, and this is during the time of W.E.B. Du Bois, scholars were having the same discussion. And one thing that Du Bois pointed out in his book, Black Reconstruction, he raised the question, well, why is it that white workers in the South are going along with this Jim Crow movement? And Du Bois came up with this notion of the wages of whiteness, that white identity sort of, in a sense, enhances the self-esteem of whites. But there's another side to this that I think gets missed in the South and gets missed when you go back 100 years. The 1920s, like the 2020s, was an age of extreme inequality. And how can you have extreme inequality that hurts so many people? And the answer here too is you go back to the origin of slavery in the of racial slavery. Racial slavery really didn't start in 1619. It started right after the Bacon Rebellion, because in 1620s, 1630s, you had both blacks and whites working in the tobacco fields in Virginia. And then there was a big rebellion. And there was a joining of black and white workers against the landowners. And the way to keep the workers or the common people from joining together in a movement against the rich aristocracy, the landowners, is to racialize those at the bottom and then divide one set of workers against the other set of workers. That benefits the aristocracy. And that has benefited the aristocracy in this nation throughout our history. And here, I was at a political science conference. I presented a paper on, which actually became a chapter in my book, on changes in labor laws under the Trump administration. And there was another researcher who was looking at the Affordable Care Act. And he looked at Tennessee and Kentucky. Kentucky expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. Tennessee refused. And he looked at counties along the borders, and he found that prior to the Affordable Care Act, both of all of these counties on the borders were experiencing increases in death rates among white workers, white male workers. And then Kentucky expanded, and these death rates were associated with the opioid addiction. Medicaid provided treatment. Death rates went down. Tennessee did not. Death rates continued to go up. And here, we have sort of a conversation like, why? Because this researcher was looking at the politics behind that. And why is it that white males in Kentucky, well, in Kentucky, once they accepted the Affordable Care Act and saw the benefits of it, they supported it. In Tennessee, they continued to oppose it, and they continued to die. And I said, well, the obvious, the obvious reason is that the people in Tennessee are being fed with misinformation. Propaganda plays a major role. Race also played a major role in the opposition to the Affordable Care Act. Affordable Care Act was racialized. And there's another book written by a physician. It's entitled Dying of Whiteness, has a chapter. And this physician did like focus group interviews. And this was totally unrelated to the research that this other researcher was doing. But he too looked at Tennessee and Kentucky. And he did focus group interviews with these, well, the one interview that really just blew my mind was when he asked this one white worker in Tennessee how come he was so opposed to the Affordable Care Act. And his answer is that, I don't want the government taking money from me and giving to those people. I'll die first. And we have racialized programs that tax people in general to expand governmental benefits to benefit all Americans and American workers. And so I think in terms of who benefits from cutting down on these programs. And we have so many programs that are just redistributing wealth and income upward. The student loan program is a prime program. And we had a secretary of education who was threatened by a federal judge this is Betsy DeVos. Federal judge threatened either you go to jail or you follow the law and you forgive those programs from students who lost their money and became in debt because of private educational or private universities that engage in out and out fraud. Who benefits from that? The investors, Wall Street. And so who benefits most from the educational system becoming indoctrination and for racial patterns of racial oppression to continue and from the stoking of racial hostility? When white workers are angry over racial hostility, they're not thinking about extreme inequality. They're not thinking about wealth and income being shifted upward to the top 1%. And there was a book, it was written by Gordon Laffers entitled The 1% Solution. And he reported on this one incident that happened in Lansing, Michigan. Of course, he's talking about states across the nation. And this happened back in, I think, around 2012. And it had to do with the passage of the Right to Work Act. I mean, the Right to Work Act. Republicans in the state of Michigan, the Governor Snyder, opposed it. The majority leader, who was the Republican majority leader, opposed it. And in this book, this author documents Dick DeVos walking in and meeting with the majority leader and giving them the Republicans an ultimatum. Either you pass this law or you'll be primary. And we have the money to do so. And money in politics plays a role here. And then organizations like Alex plays a role here. And Fox News plays a role here. This is not a populist movement. This is a false populist movement. This is the 1%ers that are promoting this, what appears to be a moral panic. But what it is, it's engineered by the 1% who wants to keep workers divided so that they can keep getting richer and richer. I'm sorry, I took up too much time.
Okay.
That's why I was like biting my tongue.
Amen.
No,
All
no,
right.
Carter, don't say anything. No, don't talk. Okay, all right. I'm
Oh,
done.
thank you, Carter. So we're going to open the floor up now to questions from the audience. And while we're doing that, I know Sheena is going to be putting together some questions from the from folks online. So if you would like to ask a question, please walk up to one of the two microphones we have here, and we'd love to hear from you.
Hi. So my question is, how can media organizations, specifically I'm talking about student media and independent organizations, help bring clarity to some of the confusion surrounding critical race theory?
Speak the truth. Truth is power.
I think framing is really important. I teach linguistic anthropology, and so we talk a lot about framing. And in terms of politics, there's two linguists, Lakoff and Johnson, who looked during the George W. Bush administration as to how Republicans got really good at framing things, right? Like the classic example is tax relief, right? Where we use the word relief in conjunction with something that's bad. So when you put relief after taxes, then it frames it as something that's bad. And it's really hard then to counter that, as someone who's like in favor of taxes, to say, well, I'm in favor of, you say I'm in favor or I'm against tax relief, right? That makes you sound bad. So I think a lot of this comes into not only like speaking the truth, yes, absolutely. Being very purposeful with the words that we're using, though, I think is so important. I think that those of us in education haven't been as good at framing in general. Some are, right? I don't want to just overgeneralize here, but haven't been so good at framing. And in terms of politics too, folks on the left haven't been so good at framing. So I think it's covering things, but then thinking of, you know, the impact of what words are we using to describe, right, critical race theory and other concepts.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
this issue, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, keep going.
Oh, I was just thinking about how, you know, one of the things that happens when color blindness as our sort of dominant racial ideology comes into being, and especially as of the 1980s, you know, there's this consensus that we really can't talk about race anymore. We shouldn't talk about it, and we shouldn't be overtly racist. So that becomes the norm. And one of the results of that is all of this coded language in our political discourse, right? We don't talk about race, but we do talk about the crack epidemic or welfare mothers, right? All of these issues that have a racial connotation attached to them. And I think being really aware of the way that discussions of race are happening through this kind of coded language is important, and not just uncritically repeating that language, the purpose of which is to propagate racist messages without appearing to do so. I think that it's important for the media to, you know, be aware of that phenomenon of coded language, and to be really careful about the language that is used, and to be really clear about it, and to define things like critical race theory instead of just repeating that phrase as if it's well understood and agreed upon by everyone who's reading.
Jen.
Thank you. This has been really, really interesting. Thank you, everybody. My name is Jen Hill. I'm a local elected official. And so I just want to invite everyone to come to our meetings. That one of the most important things that you could possibly do in the face of the things that we're talking about is to come and please be present in our local government. You can come and just be in the room with us. There's a chance, by law, you have a chance to speak for 3 minutes. And you can pretty much say whatever you want as long as you don't defame and libel us. And and then I also encourage for, you know, and then you can also be further engaged, but there are folks who are very actively attempting to bring these ideas into our local governments. So the school board meets on Mondays, the county commission meets on Tuesdays, and the city commission also meets on Monday afternoons. You can, of course, Google it and find it, but come on down, hang out. We would love to have you there. It would be in a lot of ways the exact antidote to what we're talking about. So please come. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. So you have a question?
I do. So what advice would you guys give someone entering the field of public education as a future teacher, both elementary and secondary, in a time where this is so controversial and everyone has a lot of opinions, and as you said, how students are now coming with their own background knowledge on it?
I think one thing to do, and I would suggest this about just about anything, but it is to be confident and know the factual basis. So a lot of what, if you look at a lot of the anti-CRT laws and that have either passed or been proposed, and one of the things that if you go through them, and I've gone through a lot of them, one of the things that becomes clear is Alex's role in this, because the language is so similar from one to the next, to the next, to the next. But they do. So I think you need to look at that and see what, because in a lot of cases they're setting traps. But I think that because most of them will say something like, oh, this isn't meant to prohibit you from talking about, it's not meant to prohibit you from talking about slavery. It's not meant to prohibit you from talking about this. It's only meant to prohibit you from talking about it in terms of 1619 projects, often explicitly named, or CRT. One of the things about history, at least, is the facts are clearly there. If you teach it factually, it may end up sounding like you're teaching it from a CRT perspective, simply because, as I said, the evidence was so overwhelming when legal scholars looked at it and historians looked at it, and how can you avoid some of these conclusions? But there are two things that I've seen. One was talking about and I should have mentioned this earlier, one was talking about a school in Atlanta where there's a great deal of sort of anti-CRT-ness in certain neighborhoods in Atlanta, and one area of Atlanta tried to break away from another area of Atlanta to prevent, well, they never said it was about race, but it was always about race. Yeah, of course I didn't say it was, but if you make sure that actually what you're doing is teaching the facts, and even if it is from CRT, a lot of the laws, what they're banning, what they're saying they're banning, like teaching, that making it illegal to teach that one race is inherently superior to the other. Well, CRT never said that. In fact, CRT is based on the idea that race is socially constructed, so it can't say that. I mean, the two are polar opposites. So my first, it would be to actually just be prepared to know what the facts are and to be open, but also what the schools in Atlanta were finding sort of avoided all these problems, and it relates to what I said earlier, is when they talk about these things, when they talk about race, when slavery, one of the things that they constantly talk about is that, in fact, as there was always agency and resistance and actions pushed. So you couldn't look at what historians say about slavery and come away thinking, well, the enslaved people were just passive, because that's clearly, I mean, that used to be taught. That the early 20th century racist historians said, oh, they were just passive and content. And you know, it sounds like some people want to think that that's what CRT is saying. But if you look at how people have always tried to empower themselves against oppression, then you contradict everything that the anti-CRT people are trying to say CRT is about. But in fact, that is a large part of what CRT is actually about. That would, you know.
Yeah.
Okay, I have two comments. I used to, when I was working on my doctorate at Wayne State University in Detroit, I taught in the Detroit public school system. And there are two things, or pieces of advice that I would like to give future teachers. First, the most important thing for an effective teacher is to, well, first of all, I think the most effective teachers are the ones that love their students. I mean, genuinely love their students. But secondly, effective teachers develop good and strong rapport with their parents. And you'll be surprised what you can accomplish when you have the parents behind you. And when you get this opposition, you know, to critical race theory, keep in mind that you as a teacher, you are an educator. And whatever you do, never get angry with the parents, but think in terms of your responsibility as an educator. You know, meet with the parents, talk about it, be open about it. And also, and I tell my students this, in fact, I gave a talk on critical race theory on Constitution Day, sort of a different forum and a much a broader discussion. But I ended it with explaining to my students that with a broader and deeper understanding of American history and American law, you would have not just a deeper understanding of history, but a greater appreciation of this nation. And so keep those things in mind.
Yeah, you have a question.
Can I, really quick?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Just another piece of just practical advice too, is that in a lot of smaller districts, the faculty and staff are the ones who show up to vote in the school board elections at the highest number. So a lot of other people don't show up to vote. So I think being organized at a practical level with other faculty and staff is important. And then when you go to interview for jobs, there is a nationwide teacher shortage. So interview those superintendents too and see what is the culture of the school like. I think that's really important. Right? Is it going to be a good fit for you, to be there? Because I think teachers have more power right now than they realize because they've been attacked so much. I mean, they are under attack, but there's such a nationwide shortage that we need teachers everywhere and we need dedicated teachers everywhere. So exercise that power that you do have.
Sir?
All right, so, all right, you guys have talked a lot tonight about avoiding race, so like not talking about race as the opposite to CRT, and then you talk about Fox News. I personally think a lot of main news, Fox or CNN, both sides of it are corrupt in one way, shape, or form. I don't think anyone ever on either side is telling the truth completely, but do you guys think that the constant discussion of the news coverage on race helps anything? I would argue that all it does is stoke the flame on both sides. And I think that judging a man by his character rather than his skin would solve a lot of issues. Not saying you can't talk about race. I think there is importance in talking about the difference people have. I think not talking about things like that would be foolish one way or another. But I do think that if we focused more on the character of the people around us rather than the color of their skin, a lot of issues would be solved, whether that be in law or in schools, wherever that be. But yeah, so I was wondering what your opinion on that would be.
Yeah, I'm gonna take that.
Okay, very, very good question, very good comment. And my response is twofold. Number one, Harvard University has come out with, I think, some of the most informative, amazing research on our media system. And I run into so many students that have become so cynical about the media system. But there's a book out, put out by these Harvard researchers looking at our media system, and it's entitled Network Propaganda. And if you really want to be informed about how our media operates in this country, read Network Propaganda. It begins by making a distinction between misinformation and disinformation. Very important distinction, misinformation, disinformation. All media makes mistakes. All media, it documented mistakes made by MSNBC, Rachel Carlson, CNN, and Fox News. But then it makes a distinction between the misinformation, and that's when you make a mistake, when you put out something and you find out that it wasn't true. And in legitimate media sources respond to being caught in a mistake by putting out a retraction. And the mistakes are not intentional. Sometimes newscasters engage in motivational reasoning. They sort of make assumptions that they find out that's not true. So keep in mind that CNN, MSNBC, even NPR, they all make mistakes, but all of their mistakes are not done intentionally. However, these Harvard researchers have documented, I mean, thousands and thousands of cases, especially centered on Fox News, in which the news puts out information that the newscasters actually know are false, and they do it deliberately in order to get a response. There's been a lot. It's not just the Harvard researchers, but there have been newscasters who have worked for Fox News and then quit and written books on Fox News. What is it? Let's see, the Fox Effects, Fox News hoax. I don't know. One of the best examples recently is when, and actually it was like CNN actually showed clips of Laura Ingraham saying, well, the January 6th attackers, well, they were not all Trump supporters. A lot, it was sprinkles of Antifa and other Trump supporters in the crowd. And then you find out after saying that, putting out that piece of information, Laura Ingraham calls the president's office and asks the president to call his people off, meaning that she knew full well that these were Trump supporters. And she deliberately put out that or disinformation about Antifa. There's not a oh, I'm sorry.
No.
I'll stop.
No, I wanted to ask, because there's this important thing that he asked that I want you guys to address here, beyond the media thing, which is of course important, is if we just didn't talk about race so much, would it solve itself? I mean, if we just said, you know what, race, yeah, it's there, but let's just cool it. Let's just take everybody as. Will that solve the problems that we have in our society? If we just said, yeah, you're black, I'm white, etc., but let's get over it. Would that solve the problems that we have?
Let me try to comment on that as quickly as I can. I have a chapter in my book on criminal justice policy changes under the Trump administration. And I start off by looking at Chicago and the determinants of violent crime in America. And one of the best books that I've read was written by Elliot Curie, Dangerous Roots, in which he identifies what he calls like 10 factors that are strongly associated with violent crime. And where those factors are more prominent, he identifies cities in Russia where the factors were more prominent and they had higher murder rates than Chicago. In fact, I was shocked when I read that. And then he also pointed out in the United States, we cannot deal with our violent crime problem because we racialize it. And then we turn around and say, well, let's not talk about race. No, if we talk about race and factors and be open and honest, we can solve a lot of our crime, a lot of our problems, especially our crime problems.
Yeah, Megan.
Yeah, so I want to kind of talk about the media thing just a little bit in there too, because I think, I'm absolutely hearing what you're saying, with that comment. And the name of this escapes me, and if any of you in the audience know, but there's that organization that does the skewing of the different media sources in terms of where they fall in left and right or center, and then also in terms of reliability, which I think is really helpful. I go back to that all the time to kind of look at where am I getting my information from, because it's okay to have a slant on something and a lens on something. It's different when it's just complete crap, and there's complete crap on both sides, left and right. And I also do hear you, because I think I get frustrated a lot when I watch what's called like mainstream news or just the cable news shows in general, because and their presence online as well, because a lot of it is just so tied to clicks, right, and engagement, that it's there to get a reaction. So I would say some of what you're saying, like I agree with the way in which we talk about race in the media, I don't think is productive, right? The way in which we talk about it in those social media things that pop up that people get angry about and then comment on, that is not helpful. But there are really good ways to talk about race. And, we go back kind of historically, coming from sociology and anthropology in the 1960s, the late 1960s, President Johnson put together the Kerner Commission. to investigate the civil uprisings in US cities, right? What are often called race riots, right? But to try to get to the bottom of like what caused that. It was a commission of all white guys, and their kind of assumption at the time was that it was caused by like the Black Panthers and like a militant Black movement. What they found from actually investigating, going on the ground in these cities, is it was caused by systemic racism. And they debated as a committee, you know, in the late 1960s of whether or not to call it racism, whether or not to say white racism. And they ended up using the word, and it got shelved. It was like there was a complete pushback on that, especially with the Nixon administration, you know, following. But Martin Luther King at the time had this reaction in a news interview and said that he was glad, and I'm paraphrasing, but he's glad that they used the word racism because now it's out in the open, right? If it's not out in the open and we can't talk about it and we can't fix it. So I think like when I think about how we should talk about race, if you go back and read the Kerner Commission report, which I'm sure our library has, right? If not on a digital copy, but I'm sure it's there somewhere. You know, you can see a really productive discussion of race and racism. And that did influence policy. There was all sorts of investment in, you know, early childhood programs, in, you know, school lunch programs. There was this whole policy shift that happened that actually alleviated a lot of poverty in inner cities afterwards. It got reversed later on in the Reagan administration, but it's a whole other conversation. But I think like that's a productive conversation about race. What happens when I scroll through my news feed on social media is not a productive conversation about race. And you're right, like it's not. So I'm assuming you're probably seeing a lot of that too. And I wish race wasn't talked about in that way because it's only making things worse, you know, in that regard.
So you have a question?
He was up first.
Okay, you were first. Okay, go ahead.
Just to speak to that point, I guess, it just seems like the mainstream media conversation is the main conversation that most of us are interacting with these days, especially the last 2 years. You know, your phone is your main engagement socially because of what we've been going through. And I would say that the mainstream media seems to have little or no regard to the ramifications of what they say on the greater population, which to me is inherently evil. But the question that I did have is some of the negative things that I've heard around CRT was due to some things happening in California where they were trying to institute critical race theory praxis, where they were like putting it into the daily curriculum. Like for example, one of the things I heard was like a math problem where Jeremy had 10 watermelons and Jerome had only 4 and Jerome is Black, solve the problem, you know, like where it's integrated. So I kind of wondered if, you know, I haven't heard much of why people are so nervous about CRT, but I kind of wondered if maybe this idea of like that pure integration rather than casual conversations like it has been, maybe that's starting to propagate and cause some of that dissent rather than people really being against talking about race. Because I think if you talk to like the average person, most people think that talking about race and talking through these issues is a positive thing. But I wonder if like this other, like more extreme side of things is what people are more fearful of. And I wondered if anyone had heard of that and had any comment.
I haven't heard of that particular example, but it reminds me of, you know, some of the reforms that have taken place, and I don't know how much has been gained with these sorts of reforms because there's still lots of issues with textbooks in history in particular, but in lots of subjects. But some of the reforms that have taken place in textbooks and teaching materials, trying to make them more inclusive, more representative of the diverse student body. And I don't know if that's the sort of thing that's, you know, driving this kind of example. My gut response to like, you know, can we institute critical race theory praxis across the curriculum is that sounds great. I would love to see, you know, critical approaches to race informing not just what we do in the humanities and the social sciences, but in science and math too, and STEM. I know there was it just last week, the STEM, what was the series of events called the Race in STEM? Thank you, Diversity in STEM. Yeah, I mean, this is, you know, sometimes we have this sense that talking about race and racism and other justice issues, okay, maybe there's an obvious place for it in the social sciences and the humanities, but it doesn't it doesn't fit in STEM fields. And actually, maybe it's wrong to include these kinds of issues in the way that we teach STEM fields. And I think that's a real misapprehension of the way that issues of race and racism affect the way that we experience schooling across all subjects. So I know that doesn't really speak because to the particular issue that you raised, because I don't know anything about that. But my first response to that is just, I would love to see this sort of broad scale interdisciplinary conversation about how to make pedagogy across all fields responsive to issues of race and racism.
Ellen?
One thing I would say, and related to the incidents, some incidents that took place in Tennessee. So I don't know exactly what happened in California, but incidents in Tennessee and incidents recently in Alabama. In Alabama, they were talking about in a class about symbols and how symbols change. And they ended up, or the teacher ended up using the Nazi salute as an example of symbols that changed over time. And it turns out that that same school had canceled its diversity training from the Anti-Defamation League. My response is this, that what happened in Tennessee and what happened in Alabama, and I would think sounds like probably is a similar case in California would be my gut reaction, but I don't know that the details of that case so much. Resulted more from not paying attention to what CRT has to say about how to approach these issues and then trying to make that grade level appropriate, rather than using CRT too much and where it doesn't belong. So when schools go and cancel training because it has a CRT lens to it, they're asking for a disaster when they go and then try to teach about race. And so I would say that a lot of these things happen when somebody goes and tries to teach about something without really understanding it and seeing and being well trained to do that. That math question, I can't see scholars immersed in CRT passing off on that as a legitimate question.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
I think this is a case where they actually needed more CRT training, not avoid
Not
the
less.
issue.
So we are, it's 20 to 10. We're going to have to wrap this up at some point in time, but I want to get to the 3 questions that you folks have. I am going to say that we had some questions from online. We're probably not going to get them tonight. If we don't, what I would ask you to do is to email them to me at heritage@nmu.edu, and I will pass them on to our panelists. They can answer them, and then we can send you a response to those questions. I apologize for that, but we've been at this for 2 hours, and we could probably talk all night, but you don't want that to happen. But I do want to address the questions of the young people who are here. So go ahead.
Okay, so I feel like when a lot of the criticism against CRT was brought up, the logic was, well, that's not real or CRT, like critical race theory, that's not what we stand for, was used. But if that's the truth, the objective truth is also that your movement has been hijacked, not just by Fox News, but teachers and people in powers who are moving forward as if they are teaching CRT, rather it's a teacher or a peer or just a celebrity. So it's like, if you're lobbying for something and you support it, is the disinformation being spread? Why are you not as passionate about that? Because I felt like throughout this talk, you made very good points where it was good, but I think there are also very many negatives to being allowed in the school. So if there are many things, it seems like you guys have a lot of tweaks to work out versus what the scholars think versus what an average educator thinks, because I'm not seeing a lot of middle ground with you guys. Like, it wouldn't take me long to Google articles of teachers like spreading things saying this is CRT, because they are saying you guys do believe in the same thing, yet you guys are saying something different. So what are you going to do about that? Because I'm Catholic, and when people talk about the sexual abuse scandal, I can't say, oh, well, that priest isn't a real Catholic. It's my job to do something. So if you're lobbying for CRT, I need something more than, well, that's not what we really believe in. Thank you.
I think, first of all, like, critical race theory originated and is still most often used in law schools, right? So, you know, when I had made reference before about some things, I can't understand how they would be taught without some kind of lens of critical race theory. Really, that's an aspect of critical race theory of just acknowledging systemic oppression, right? The rest of it is all, I mean, if you delve into the literature, it is all very much law school based, very much legal argument based. It has crossed over into fields of education in terms of college education and larger philosophical discussions of education. But in terms of people sitting down and like developing you know, CRT curriculum for K through 12, like, I have never encountered that. Like, that's just not what folks are up to. So I think that that's part of the issue, is that, and I think folks have been trying to clarify that by saying this is not in, you know, this curriculum is not in the K through 12 school. Where I think there's this kind of misunderstanding is that even though the critical race theory is not in the K through 12 school, there is still needs to be a discussion of race, right, in K through 12, and there still needs to be a discussion of systemic oppression in K through 12. And I think from an educator perspective, looking at the available materials in K through 12, there are a lot of materials that are lacking, right? And so I think, like, as you know, for folks in the field of education, definitely need to, I don't know, organize more on that, but part of it is also capitalist driven too, because you have big states like Texas that are some of the largest purchasers of textbooks and curriculum, and that drives the curriculum for other states. So it's, you know, I hear what you're saying, you know, in that, but I guess the main point is critical race theorists are not designing K through 12 education, right? But I think as educators, we want discussions of race and racism to occur in K through 12 schools, and that those materials there are issues with it. Case in point, you know, my daughter came home from Marquette schools, and I want to just clarify that I was not in the classroom, so I don't know what she retained as a 6-year-old, right? But she came home on Martin Luther King Jr. Day and said, you know, well, it's Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I said, well, what did you learn? And she goes, well, there was just this, we saw men pointing. I was like, men pointing. And I was like, oh, like outside of the Lorraine Hotel, right? And so I said, she said, he was shot. And I said, okay, yeah, he was. And I was like, do you know why he was shot? No, right? And I don't, again, she's 6, so I don't know if they had that discussion and she just didn't remember it. But I think, you know, we can see with kids who are older, where there is a discussion of things just on the surface level, right? Without getting in the depth as to why did those things happen. And I think that that's kind of what we're, you know, calling for in the K through 12 schools. But again, what exists as the body of literature of critical race theory is really legal based.
Could I respond to that?
Yeah.
Quickly? Okay, so like I hear what you're saying. So since it is legal based, and like most of it, I think we'll go over, even my head, I'm not good with legal things. Would it not just be until we refine the system to make sure that people are receiving the information you think they need, better restrict it in K through 12, since it's not built to be modified for that, versus little girls going home and hating their white fathers because it's being delivered to them wrong?
I think a lot of the stories that are coming out about this are really these individual kind of anecdotal stories. I'm kind of a data person, and I have not, again, seen any evidence of wide sweeping curriculum, you know, on critical race theory at all. I have seen a couple of stories that emerge, and they are backed, honestly, by think tanks, and they get placed into local news, and then they spread into national news, and then we all hear about it, right? But you don't have kids coming home in mass crying because they don't like that they're white anymore because of some instruction they got in school. That's just simply not, it's not happening. And as someone's coming from a school district where we purposely taught things about race because we had, again, over 50% of our students were Indigenous, we didn't have our white students going home every day in tears, right? It didn't happen. So I think part of this is we need to be critical about what stories that we're hearing. And I would search that story out, and you're going to see it repeated again and again and again. And you're going to see the language that that girl's mother uses that is almost exactly the language that comes from these think tanks. And so again, just be cautious of those, because then we get this idea that this is happening all over the place and it's this big crisis, when in reality it's not.
Okay. Well, this is the last thing I'm gonna say because I feel like I'm hogging the
Yeah.
mic. So I use that example because that's what he used, but I'm from Detroit, predominantly Black area. And like, I do see it. I saw my classmates, I saw my Black teachers encourage us to tell our white classmates that, to blame them and say like, you have to do better, to constantly like make us compete, which I think that's good. We all need to have healthy competitiveness. I've also watched my little sister who just started high school go from having white friends to saying, I'll never talk to a white person again, just by what she's taught. And like you said, that is antidote, whatever word you use, can't say it. Like, that is not everybody, but I think it is also a valid concern. Yes, there are people who have agendas who spread articles to make you get riled up, but it is also happening. And I've seen it. I've experienced it. I have friends who've experienced it. And I think your movement can be just as powerful, if not more, if you acknowledge the harm that it can also cause as well as the good.
I think within that, absolutely. And even though that's like a personal experience, it's incredibly valid. Like that I know happened, right? Because you're telling me that. So like that's different. But I think that comes from being in a culture where we're not good about talking about race, right? We talk a lot, we hear the word a lot, but we don't talk about it in a meaningful way. The same thing with social class, right? We hear social class a lot, but we don't talk about it in a meaningful way. So I think some of what kind of then trickles into those experiences that we've had, and I grew up in Metro Detroit too, I had those experiences too, right? I completely understand. But that I think is really influenced by the fact that we need to be better about talking about race. When we are made anxious about it, when we're told we shouldn't talk about it, then when it does get talked about, it's not discussed in a productive way. Right? I mean, as someone who teaches about race in my classes, like it's taken me years, right, to I think teach it in a way that's effective. And we do all mess up sometimes too. I mean, there are some days where I'm like, oh, I should have given this example instead of this one. But I don't think, like in a K through 12 system, our teachers are really overworked, right? You have curriculum changes that are made without a lot of guidance, and so there's a lot of problems with the system in K through 12. So,
Thank you very much for your questions and your comments.
Okay, I had a different question, but based off of that, I wanted to change it. So we mentioned like the fears and the pushback for CRT, but like, what are the positives? What are the benefits of it? I feel like we've talked a lot about the law and the theory, but like, what are the benefits you see as a help society?
Well,
one thing I would say, I mean, since a lot of it is focused on questions of systemic racism, and as it's embedded into different institutions, you can't figure out how to change and make the institutions better and more just unless you know what is causing them to be unjust. What is the root of that injustice? So while I think that there are benefits, and there's certainly benefits and there's certainly issues, and if it can be difficult to talk about, but how can we, since a lot of it does deal with law, how can we really address questions of unequal justice if we don't actually know why? And how do you address those problems? When we know, for example, that certain types of mandatory sentencing laws are going to, I mean, we know this now, if you have certain types of mandatory sentencing laws, those are almost always going to fall harder on an African-American population than on a white population. But if you don't know that, how can you craft laws that don't do that, that aren't discriminatory. So the key is figure out where's the problem so that you can have ideas about how to fix those problems. Because despite the accusation that CRT scholars see this is sort of so embedded that racism can't be overcome, the whole point of doing it always was for the legal scholars to uncover the problems so that the problems can be solved.
So it seems like we're still kind of searching for the hows and the whys. Don't you think that that is really discouraging and harming potential?
I'm not sure I understand that. I mean, to search.
So, I mean, like you just said, like, we're still like trying to figure out the best way to implement this, right? Is that what I understood?
Well, trying to figure out
Implement.
ways to decrease injustice.
Yes. And don't you think, again, with the talk on like how it's portrayed in media and schools, don't you think that it's harming and discouraging people's potential motivation and drive?
Well, I think that there's some people who think it is, but would it be better to just leave the injustice in place? I mean, some people may get discouraged in the process of fighting against injustice, but I don't see that as meaning the fight shouldn't go on. I mean, I can see where it's discouraging. I can understand the idea that it comes out of a kind of discouragement. It comes out of saying, well, we have the 1965 Civil Rights Act. We have these changes in the laws. Why hasn't progress really lived up to its promise? But that's always been the question. I mean, this was David Walker's question in 1829 and Frederick Douglass's question in the 1840s. Why hasn't the country lived up to its promise of liberty for all? You know, in the Constitution, there's a call for liberty and for justice. In the Declaration of Independence, there are these statements. Why hasn't the country lived up to that? Very discouraging to face this fact, year after year. But if they gave up, or if the civil rights activists gave up, so yes, it can be discouraging. But how else do you go forward?
Okay, like you, I could talk all night, so I'm finishing with this. But I feel like just CRT is placing a shadow over the real injustices that are out there. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for answering the questions and for hosting this.
Thank you very much. Your next question.
Hi guys, thanks for putting this on. My question is more related to the parents. I know that's come up a couple times, is like parents who are a little like nervous about this or who outright don't want it. And I think an instance that might be less anecdotal than the biracial girl, would be like, for example, the election of like Glenn Youngkin in Virginia, because he ran on some of that stuff. And I was kind of wondering, like, what do you guys make of that? Like, all the parents who voted for him, are they just horribly misinformed, or could like the material be the reason that they don't want it? Like the material itself.
I don't think I think some people probably have read it, what is actual critical race theory. And if you are interested, like anyone said, I have books you can borrow. We've got some. There's a great one that's our library has that you can just online get access to. So please email me and I will send that to you. It's incredibly accessible. A lot of this comes from, though, and this is anecdotal for me, but when I was on the school board as someone who was pushing for a DEI officer in the school and pushing for diversity training for our faculty and staff. And when I would get pushback on that in the frame of critical race theory, I would turn it around and ask, well, what is critical race theory, right? and there's silence. There's crickets. And the same thing happened. Lavelle Brown is a superintendent for Ithaca Public Schools and has a book called Culture of Love, which is about teaching basically for diversity, right? And helping kids, especially racial minorities, to be successful in the school system. And he's had the same experience when he goes on the lecture circuit, because people pay thousands of dollars for him to come in and do trainings. When people are critical about critical race theory, he says, well, what is it? And there's just this quiet that happens. So part of it is that people aren't reading the actual material, right? And there is some really accessible material. Like when I forget who made the comment of, it's law stuff is probably, over my head. One, law, we have to demystify that, because a lot of law is not all that complex. No offense to lawyers out there, but we do. But I have a really great book. If you email me, if you look me up on the website, I will send it to you. It's broken up into sections. I have a couple of my students here who read it in my theory class last semester. They can attest that it's a very easy book to read, and it's written by some of the founders of critical race theory. And so I think actually reading that and seeing it is so helpful. And that book has, it's just critical race theory, but it's Delgado and Stefanik, and they have like discussions too after each chapter, which are meant for law students, but they're really accessible. In fact, you could have them with your family. So I think just, again, actually reading things that are written by critical race theorists would help so much, because the stuff that's in the media about it is not coming from their actual material.
Carter, could you comment on the Virginia election?
I wanted to make a couple of comments about the educational process and make this clear that we do not have a movement in this country that's promoting critical race theory in K through 12 curriculum. Critical race theory is not in K through 12 curriculum. It's not there. Critical race theory originated at Harvard University as a approach to the study of civil rights and constitutional law. And there's a broad literature, complex literature, that is not taught in K through 12. But there is another issue here, and there is the issue that has a lot to do with academic freedom in K through 12, and whether or not we should have a broad education and educate our kids fully in terms of what historians are offering, and then sharing history in K through 12 without any efforts to promote critical race theory. There's another sideline issue, though, that has to do with issues of justice and being able to deal with injustice in our society. But that's quite apart from teaching history. And there has been an enormous development in terms of a flood of new history books, in addition to the 1619 project. I was going to mention, and I've mentioned this, Aziz Reina, the Two Faces of American Freedom, which talks about conflicts that have been going on from the very beginning. And it complements, well, actually it came out before the 1619 project, but it talks about the American Revolution as not being one revolution, but multiple revolutions. And not one leader, but multiple leaders with multiple perspectives. And so we have a choice here in our educational institutions. Are we going to teach our kids the broad perspective and the multiple ideas that the leaders of the American Revolution had, which includes Thomas Paine, but it also includes William Manning, who believed in human liberation, the empowerment of workers, Black and white, on the one hand, that also believes in the rights of Native Americans, on the one hand. And then you had others, actually you had people who were engaging in molasses smuggling and who were fighting against what they considered to be British monopolies and laws that prohibit, free trade and force people to buy high-priced tea from the East Indian Tea Company. That's part of it. But then there's Lord Dunsmore in Virginia that was sided with the British and did a number of things that actually changed the attitude in the Southern colonies. Southern colonies were not talking about independence until after the Lord Dunsmore threat, to give freedom to slaves. But here, there is so much that young people can learn about American history, which would give them a much deeper understanding of American history and would actually make it easier for our, when they come to universities, to learn American history. Teachers need to be able to teach. This anti-critical race movement is not a movement against the promotion of critical race theory in the curriculum. It is a movement to censor teachers. And yes, there are cases of kids in school that are mean to other kids in school. And that meanness may overlap with racial conflicts. That happens. But to say that this came from some abstract, esoteric theory taught at Harvard University as responsible for those conflicts is just preposterous.
All right. Do you have any other comments?
And I guess really quick, I don't want to take up too much time. So would you say that something like CRT or 1619, would that then work? Is there like still a place for, I guess, the more traditional history that a lot of us have grown up learning? Because I would say that's kind of the history I fell in love with, and I would hate to see it go. Like, are they kind of in theory working in tandem then, or is one have to take over the other?
Well, here, let me ask you this. Were you aware that Thomas Jefferson believed in minimalist government? Were you aware that Alexander Hamilton wanted expanded government? Oh, so you were aware of those conflicts? Oh, okay. Well, then
Like, a little.
you were getting that broader education. Were you aware that Thomas Paine advocated providing resources for young people to start off, that government sort of had a responsibility to redistribute wealth to young people? I rest my case.
Well, as
Go ahead, Ellen.
as an historian, I would say that it's an expanding. I mean, that, what you are calling the traditional history that you fell in love with was, and I'm assuming that you're under 50, was considered a radical deviation from the history that Charles Beard would have written, which was a radical deviation from the traditional history that William Dunning wrote, which was a radical deviation. So it's an ever-changing field. Now, history has clearly been influenced in the last 20 years by critical race theory, but I don't think the critical race theory has shaped history. As I said, I think the two have looked at the past, the legal past, the social past, that's a confluence of conclusions, more than it is a collusion of ideas. Although historians have borrowed probably the insights about the problems of colorblind law theory, probably more than most other parts of CRT, that has actually been recently incorporated into historical scholarship. But it isn't that that's the plan. So no historian, I don't think, would say, and this was what Edmund Morgan's point was, it's the central paradox. You can't talk about the coming of the American Revolution without the problems of taxation and molasses smuggling. And I always like to talk about Sam Adams as America's most famous tax evader. And you have That's important, but so are these other narratives. And so when we get to these parts, the traditional history that I learned, I'm sure is different from the tradition, is definitely different from the traditional history that you learned. And that's very different from the traditional history that my father would have learned. So one of the problems, I think, is that when people say they want the traditional history, they want the history they learned, but they don't necessarily want the traditional history of the prior generation or the prior generation or the next generation. I often say that people see the unbiased history usually is the one that they learn in grade school and high school, but it's all biased, it's all constructed. So I'm glad you fell in love with one story of history. I hope that you can realize that it was a constructed narrative. And there are other ways of looking at the same questions. So but nobody's saying we need to throw out the idea, at least among historians. Historians aren't saying, well, let's just throw out the entire concept that, you know, liberty and equality were part of the founding of the country. But let's complicate it and say, well, what did they mean by those things at that time and who was included? And then look also at people like David Walker and Frederick Douglass, who then challenged them to include more people. That's, I think, so when you worry about traditional history, I think try just to realize that that's only a traditional history for one generation at a time.
Thank you. So I'm going to close this out, folks. I do want to give one anecdotal story, though. I grew up in the Western Upper Peninsula in a small, very, very, very white, very Finnish community, actually. My high school history teacher was my football coach. And I learned that history, that traditional history of the early 1980s that was in the textbooks that were probably actually written in the 60s. We learned nothing about the civil rights movement. We learned very little about slavery, other than there were slaves. One night I went home and I turned on WNMU, our public television station, and watched a documentary called Eye and the Prize about the civil rights movement. It changed me. It taught me things I'd never heard before. I'd never been taught before. To me, my whole view of history, my whole view of our American society was shaped by that one moment. I don't hate white people because of it. I don't hate anyone, really. I sure as hell hate some of the policemen who did some of the things that they were doing in the South and the Klan. But I didn't hate America because I learned this. I gained a greater appreciation of what America is about. Exposing people to these things does not make anti-Americans. It doesn't make communists. It doesn't make socialists. What it does is it expands people's minds and opens their eyes to a world that they never knew existed. What I'm frightened about these laws is that we are saying you can't do that. You can't do that. You can't make a documentary and put it on public television that's going to shape someone's life. You can't teach in a class that there was slavery and that this was the impact. Whether you agree with you're conservative or a liberal or otherwise, we can all agree that we should have the right to say these things and change people's lives. We shouldn't use it to hate each other. And any teacher who does, in my opinion, is missing the point. The point is not to teach us to hate each other. It is to bring people together. And that film did not teach me to hate anyone. It taught me to love people who I had never met, never knew in my entire life and what they went through. I want to thank you all for coming here tonight. I want to thank you for your strength in staying here for 2.5 hours to talk about this issue. But I want to thank our panelists for everything. Thank you very much for being here. And with that, we hope to see you at some other events in the future. Have a great semester. Thank you.